Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of a Life on the Civil War research trail. The woman pictured here, Helen Gilson, is one of the most fascinating individuals to come out of the Civil War. She was living in Chelsea, Massachusetts, where she was governess for the mayor of Chelsea, a man named Frank Fay. And when the Civil War began, after the war began, after one of those early battles in Virginia, Frank Fay went down to Washington, D.C. to bring home the wounded men from Chelsea who were in the hospitals of Washington. Eventually, Frank's experience piqued Helen's interest, and she went off and had a whole war experience. She would turn up at parades, she would turn up at hospitals, on transport vessels, on battlefields, all over the place. She was omnipresent. And she was also a big part of the Third Army Corps. Daniel Sickles is perhaps the best known commander of the Third Corps. And one of Sickles' staffers, a man named James Fowler Rusling, who I've talked about on several other videos, left behind a wonderful remembrance of Helen Gilson. I want to read it to you because he really pays tribute to her, and he pays tribute to all the women who helped the war effort behind the lines and in part of the war itself, acting as nurses. So let me read this to you. It's titled The Angel of the Third Corps. So here we go. It is true that our mothers and sisters, our wives and sweethearts, did not do any fighting during the war. They did not carry muskets, nor swing sabers, nor storm batteries, nor even campaign and march with us. But they did pretty much everything else, and in many instances and on frequent occasions, they felt the war even more keenly than the average officer or soldier did. They scraped lint for bandages. They made Havelock hats and hospital bandages. They packed our knapsacks. They cheered us when we left. They prayed for us while absent, and they welcomed our return. They were our faithful allies in the rear, and with cheerful hearts sent their bravest and best to the front for 4 long years, though certain of heartbreaking news sooner or later. Alas, how long they were to many a poor lady. So too, these allies thronged our hospitals and hospital boats, both at the front and in the rear, and by their angelic presence and divine sympathy, saved many a poor fellow's life or eased and comforted his dying hours. So, too, they organized soldiers' children's homes all over the North, where the orphaned children of our soldiers would be tenderly cared for and educated, and future homes provided for them. What nobler work could there be than this? I did not meet Mother Bickerdike, that's Mary Ann Bickerdike, of Western memory. She's the well known nurse of the Western Theater. But, Rusling says, I did meet Miss Gilson of Eastern memory and begged to record some recollections of her here. For over 2 years, she came under my frequent observation in the Army of the Potomac, and I personally knew her and esteemed her greatly. Her full name was Helen L. Gilson, and she was from Chelsea, near Boston. She was a young lady of beauty and culture, bred in the best New England ways, and there are no better ways anywhere. She came down to the Army and entered upon hospital life solely because of her intense New England patriotism and high sense of Christian duty. An aside, as evidenced by the cross she's wearing on her dress. She did not linger at Washington or Alexandria, as many other nurses did, but joined the Army, ready for field duty with her own stout wagons and horses, camp equipage, etc., complete, at her own charge and expense. She had her carriage for bad weather, but generally rode on horseback, a perfect horsewoman, and a handsome picture she made on the background of army life, well, but never showily attired and reining her thoroughbred well in hand. She was never alone, but always accompanied by an elderly gentleman, I think the mayor of Chelsea or some other old home friend. That's Rusling describing Frank Fay, who obviously Rusling was not aware of his name. Rusling continues. At parades and reviews, she was often in evidence and apparently enjoyed such military spectacles, but did not affect the society of our brigadiers and their staff officers, charmed as many were with her. Nor did she repel our gold laced hotspurs, but went on her own sweet way among both officers and men, wherever her chosen hospital work took her. Many a young aide and surgeon or assistant surgeon fell desperately in love with her, but all their sighings and pleadings were in vain. She seemed to be as cold as Minerva, or as if already vowed to another and meaning to keep her vow. That vow, of course, to her religion and to her duty as a nurse. Rusling continues. I met her first at the White House, Virginia, White House Landing on the peninsula, the Virginia Peninsula, in June 1862, where she was serving on a hospital boat, nursing our sick and wounded after the Battle of Fair Oaks, or Seven Pines, as the Confederates call it. We were lying in front of Richmond, and I had been sent back to the White House for clothing, camp equipage, etc., and not getting through with my requisitions, had to stay all night there. There was no hotel. The White House was merely an army depot, and I was given quarters on her boat for the night with some other officers. After supper, we gathered on deck and chatted for a long time on that mild June evening, rehearsing our various experiences, Miss Gilson among us. She spun her yarns with the rest of us, but also modestly and intelligently that everybody was delighted with her. We parted reluctantly, all expressing a hope we might sometime meet again. Rusling continues. A month or so afterward, along in early July, after McClellan's famous change of base to Harrison's Landing, or the 7 Days Battle, as it was euphemistically called, I was going down the James River on a hospital boat myself, burning up with the Chickahominy fever, about as bad as the Santiago fever, I guess, when the door of my stateroom quietly opened and in stepped Miss Gilson with a bowl of iced lemonade, the first ice I had seen that summer. She did not recognize me at first. I was so sallow and wan and fever-stricken and used up, but I quickly recognized her and really thought her an angel or something akin to one, and I have never drunk a draught that seemed half so good as that iced lemonade. Then she sopped my head with ice water and bathed my face and hands, and presently also recognized me. But I soon dropped into a deep sleep from which I did not awake until we reached Fortress Monroe. Ill as I was, I had been in the saddle for 2 or 3 days and nights most of the time, as necessitated by that strategic change of base, and now was en route for home on sick leave. I had read about the angel of the camp, but here was one in propria persona. Afterward, I often saw her riding and driving through the army, but remember her particularly in the great field hospitals at Potomac Creek after the bloody battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Virginia, 1862 and 1863. She was dressing wounds and nursing the sick there, a good Samaritan and very deed. In the intervals of this Christ-like work, she would read religious and patriotic pieces to our poor fellows, or sing like a seraph. She was never careless in her dress, but was always simply and tastefully habited, as if the only lady present, as evidenced here, by the way. And she usually wore a white veil, which you can also see, twined about her head to hold back her abundant chestnut hair. During all those dark days of the winter and spring, of 1862 to 1863. She made her headquarters with the Third Corps and moved about our vast hospital tents there, a vision of grace and beauty, as well as charity and mercy. It is no wonder that our boys in blue of the old Third Army Corps christened her our Angel of the Corps, our American Florence Nightingale, and like the British heroes of the Crimea, with the original Florence Nightingale, turned to kiss her shadow on the wall as she passed along the hospital wards. During that winter of 1862 to 1863, while we lay near Falmouth, Virginia, many colored people were also brought into our hospitals. Poor, abandoned slaves, broken down and used up and abandoned because no longer of any use to their masters, all suffering unspeakable hardships and exposures. But Miss Gilson cared for these poor fellow creatures just as gently and tenderly as for our Union soldiers. For they were all God's creatures in her eyes, and should they not have all the same kindly care? I remember one poor slave boy, 13 or 14 years old, that was brought into our camp while we lay at Boscobel near Falmouth, a former plantation of George Washington's, I believe. He, the young boy, had been abused and neglected, and his limbs were so frostbitten and injured that he had to have both feet amputated and thus be made a helpless cripple for life. But Miss Gilson cheered and comforted him, sat by his side for days, taught him to read and write, read and sang to him by the hour, as well as prayed for him and taught him how to pray, and thus charmed his pains and sorrows away. I never knew what became of him afterward, but I suppose that some kind man or woman got him north into a good home after the war closed. After Chancellorsville, she went to Gettysburg with the Army of the Potomac, I believe, or joined it soon afterward, and continued with it until 1864 or thereabouts. She went down to South Carolina to look after the freedmen there, believing that they needed her most. She continued there nursing and teaching in the camps and hospitals and on the plantations there until the close of the war. But I was ordered west in November 1863 and never saw her afterward. After the war, she married some worthy Massachusetts man, but she is now many years deceased. The 3rd Union Army Corps, I am glad to say, subsequently erected a handsome monument to her at Chelsea, Massachusetts. But her life record is her own best monument. No purer patriot, no nobler lady, or truer American lived during our great Civil War, and I beg to lay upon her distant New England grave this passing tribute to her memory. And so that's the story as told by James Fowler Rusling, staff officer to the Union Army's 3rd Corps, particularly General Dan Sickles. One thing I want to point out here, Rusling mentions that she had died many years before he wrote this recollection. That recollection was written in 1899, and he was right. Gilson died in 1868, barely outliving the war. She died in childbirth, as so many, a number of women did. Child mortality and deaths of women in childbirth were very high compared to today's numbers. And the cause of that childbirth was partly attributed to her body being so weakened from exposure in the field to disease to taking care of the wounded and the elements during those years of war. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.